Thank you, Todd. Well, tonight I want to talk about one of my favorite areas, and that's the Verde Valley. This presentation is based upon several years of work that I've been doing, trying to get a better handle on the last stage of the Sinagua during what we call the Tuzigoot phase, named after, of course, Tuzigoot. Okay. Now, the Sinagua is a prehistorically recognizable entity. First appears in the archaeology of the Verde Valley around 500, 600 AD, somewhere in that time span, when we sort of see a transition from archaic style projectile points, distributions, and the beginnings of ceramics in the Verde Valley. And with the appearance of ceramics and, of course, sedentary agricultural pursuits, we have the, quote, Southern Sinagua. Now, of course, one of the attractions archaeologically about the Verde are the fantastic cliff dwellings and big pueblos that we've got. And that's attracted most of the interest ever since the first Spanish explorers came into the Verde Valley. And over the years, people have, wondered about these big sites that they've seen, who lived here and what was going on, and why are all of these sites, on these high points and things. And over the years, a basic concept has emerged. The basic interpretation of the Tuzigoot phase is an effort to find out what was happening in the last years of this culture. The traditional idea has it that the population that in earlier years had been scattered out across the entire valley began to aggregate into a restricted number of fairly large pueblos. Now, by large pueblos, here in the Verde, we're talking about 20 to over 20 rooms. Some of them go over 100 some odd rooms, but the average size is about 20 to 30 rooms. Now, by Southwestern standards, that's not real big. A number of years ago, I was invited to take part in a conference that looked at the Pueblo IV period throughout the entire Southwest. And they wanted to focus on large sites. And so I went through the literature, got all my notes together, and got my listing of the big sites down here. And so, our biggest site is like 120 rooms, and then, like I said, most of them are 20 to 30. And when I got there, the Mesa Verde people began to talk about their big sites. 500 rooms, 1,000 rooms, 1,500 rooms. Chaco people came in, 1,000 rooms, 2,000 rooms, 1 billion rooms. And then I come up, well, we got 30 rooms over here. And so by the big Southwest standards, we may not be as big as they are, but our archaeology is just as fascinating. Well, roughly we have somewhere between 46 and 52 large pueblos here in the Verde Valley that are the last structures that were built and that represent this contraction of the population into riverine side locations. The general tendency has been to say that the results of aggregation are due to conflict between people. Supposedly the climate change, water dries up, people start fighting each other for land, and this all eventually leads to an abandonment. The classic Southwest story of, and came 1400, they all disappeared for reasons we don't know. Okay. Well, that's a little overly simplistic, but we'll get into that with the rest of the talk. Now, in order to put this together, the first thing I had to do was to pull together all of the existing data. And that stretches back to the 1800s when Dr. Edgar Mearns did some of the first archaeological work in the Verde Valley. And over the years, there has been lots of confusion in the literature. And so I had to go back to the original sources and sort this all out. Many sites had been given several different site numbers. If you didn't know them, you would think that they were 4 separate sites. And it took a long time to work it all out. Some of the problems of dealing with the archaeology and prehistory of the Tuzigoot phase is that most of it has been pot hunted. Over the years, pot hunters have been attracted to the big sites because that's where they found lots of burials and lots of pottery and lots of goodies. And there's not a single site of those 50 or so pueblos that has not been pretty considerably ransacked over the decades by pot hunters. Despite that, we have very little excavation data to go by. People go to Tuzigoot and see this big excavated structure. They look up and see Montezuma Castle, and they assume that we must know an awful lot from these sites. But the fact of the matter is there's only 2 sites in the Verde Valley that have ever had any professional excavation work done to them. Tuzigoot is one, and people would debate whether that was truly professional or not. And the second one is the Oak Creek Valley Pueblo on private land down by Cornville, in which I think it's something like 6 of 15 rooms were excavated by a master's student at NAU. And that's it. That's the only excavated data we have for the Tuzigoot phase. And that's not much to go on. And along with that, it's very difficult to get dates down here. Just ask any guy. And part of that is because the pottery doesn't change. The earliest pottery has somewhat different temper than the later stuff, but for the most part, they exist unchanged for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the plainware pottery isn't of much use to get dates from. Tree ring dating. We've all heard about tree ring dating and the wonders of it. Well, we've done several projects trying to get tree ring dates down here. The problem, however, is that the wood that we find down here doesn't date. And that's because the Verde Valley is what we up north would call the banana belt. The climate down here is so regular and uniform that the trees don't put on the sequence of big rings and small rings based upon precipitation differences. So tree ring dating doesn't work down here. Another thing is that so far we only have sampled about 11% of the Verde Valley, and there are a number of gaps in our survey coverage. Now, the prehistoric Sinagua were primarily farmers, and as farmers they would live along the permanent waterways where the permanent water and best farming soils are located. But unfortunately for me, most of that land alongside the rivers and the streams is private, so it's not really accessible to archaeologists to see what is on that private land. This is, again, the kind of projects that groups like the Center can be a big help in. By having local people who know these landowners, you folks will have a better chance of being able to survey those kinds of land status areas to really find out what's out there, whereas I'm restricted to federal land, the Forest Service land. So we have a gap in our coverage. A lot of the data that we have was collected decades, if not centuries ago. Back in the 1930s, a site card consisted of a little 3x5 card that says, "Big Ruin near George's ranch house." And that's about it. And we don't know who George was. And so a lot of it is you have to stumble back upon the site and say, well, we know that George's ranch was somewhere down here, so this must be the site they're talking about. But when you put it all together, when I've reviewed all the records at all the institutions in Arizona, now this is what we come up with, that there might be 140, say 150 sites that we more or less know about. And that's the distribution of them. And as you can see, they don't call us the Mighty Coke for nothing. We got most of them on us. The real surprise that I had was when I did all of this comparison of things and shuffled through the records, what I finally learned about is that all of the big sites had been found by the earliest settlers in the Verde Valley. Dr. Edgar Mearns' report from the 1880s had every single big site from Chavez Pass down into the lower Verde. So they knew about all of them. And as we look closely at the data and the records, we found a number of interesting things too. Is that a lot of the records, because of the size of the wall fall, assumed that many of the structures were 2 stories tall. But if you look at them more critically and with the pot-hunted remains that we've seen, I think that most of them were only a single story tall. Now some were bigger than that, but in the survey records, many of them are listed as being 2 stories tall, and with field checking, they're not that big. So that brings down our estimate of room counts and thereby the population. Also, the traditional wisdom has it that everybody moved down to the waterways into the big sites. Well, now we know that that's not the case. Those of you who have been working with Jerry in his surveys up on the Mogollon Rim know that you have at least 2 big sites up there and a host of smaller settlements, smaller pueblos and field houses. So it's not restricted to the riparian settings. So it's a bigger picture than what has normally been interpreted. And as we do additional surveys, we're finding that there are more sites, especially in the upland area, the area outside the valley proper. And there seems to be a regular pattern here, that when we have a big site, without fail, it turns out that those big sites, back at the Tuzigoot phase, began as smaller pueblos in the preceding Honanki phase, 1150 to 1250. So the Honanki phase is when we have the widest distribution of sites in the Verde Valley. In fact, the majority of sites that we've got recorded date to the Honanki phase. But it seems that only a few of those sites lasted long enough to absorb the population from the scattered sites to all become these aggregated settlements spaced along the valley. One of our important discoveries was made about the same time that other archaeologists working in northern Arizona made the same discovery. And that is that there is a time difference between the appearance and the quantity of pottery from the Homolovi group of ruins in the Little Colorado versus those that come down from the Hopi mesas. Basically what we discovered is that we can divide the Tuzigoot phase into two segments. An early Tuzigoot phase indicated by a dominance of Verde brown and Little Colorado Winslow orangeware, and late Tuzigoot dominated by the Jedito series and Tuzigoot pottery. So we now have a tool for getting a little bit finer resolution of sites than we had before we started this project. And we also have a wider range of site types. There are many other kinds of pueblos out there, of sites out there, besides the big pueblos. One of the really surprising ones was a pit house. Now we only know of one of those that was excavated as part of a land exchange near Bridgeport. What's interesting about it, though, is it closely resembles some of the late pit houses that you find up in the Kayenta-Anasazi country. Now, if you read your basic textbooks on Southwest archaeology, you're fed one of a number of fairy tales. And one of them is that there is a pit house to Pueblo transition. At April 3rd, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, every single person jumped out of their pit houses, tore them down, and began building pueblos and began becoming civilized. Well, every culture that we've looked at in the Southwest, we do find that there are pit houses that extend late into time. In fact, our own culture lived in pit houses. Ever hear of the dugouts in the plains, the sod houses? Those are pit houses. Okay. So everybody in the world actually has used pit houses through all time periods. One of the most numerous kind of sites that we see in the Verde, as we do in Flagstaff, are field houses. Small 1 to 3 room structures that have a dearth of artifacts and are used just during the planting and harvesting seasons. Okay. Most of the ones that we find, though, are in the uplands, which makes some sense because in terms of the farmable land, you have much more farmable land down in the valley proper than you do up in the rim country. After that, we have different size classes of rooms. 4 specific classes seem to work out when you plot the numbers of rooms on a graph. And so we have, the smaller ones, 7 to 17 rooms. Then it jumps, 20 to 30, 50 to 100, and then the big guys. And as you can see, there's only a fairly small number of the really big ones. One thing we have noticed, though, in the site plans, and this is a tribute to some of the early work in the Verde Valley that was done around the turn of the century, that made these just marvelously detailed maps that for the most part are quite accurate. But one thing we've noticed is that the early Tuzigoot phase rooms tend to be small and the later ones tend to be big. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The early ones are big, the later ones are small. And in fact, you can even see in some of the sketches like this that some of the big rooms were intentionally divided into smaller units during the later occupation of the sites. So the big rooms that you see tend to be from the earlier occupation. The smaller rooms would be from the later occupation. We have two layouts, basic layouts, that are also found in the Southwest, throughout the Southwest. We have the massed room block, which is just a solid unit pueblo. And then we do have an occasional plaza. Now, a plaza layout, like you see at Wingfield Mesa, is very, very rare in the Verde Valley. This is about the only really good one, although there are a few other ones that come close to being plazas. But they're not true plazas in the sense that this one is, of where the room blocks themselves form all sides around a plaza. As I said, this is more typical of what you see up in the Kayenta-Anasazi country. And the big one, the best example of it, of course, is the Wingfield Mesa ruin. But even that is difficult to work with because every single room there has been pot hunted. And in the 1960s, a miner came with his bulldozer and wiped out one corner of it. One of the exciting discoveries, though, was the identification of ceremonial architecture. Again, according to some of the early textbooks, you'll read that one characteristic that sets the Sinagua apart from other groups in northern Arizona is their lack of ceremonial and communal structures. Well, we now know that that's not the case. We know that they have kivas, smaller structures. Down here, they tend to be rectangular with a raised bench across the north end. You're more familiar with classic Pueblo kivas that you see up north, like at Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and Navajo National Monument, that tend to be circular. We also have identified what we're calling community rooms. And these occur at only certain numbers of the really big sites. And these are rooms that are about 4 times bigger than the normal one. And they tend to occur at sites that we suspect would be more of a community center for the people who lived over a much broader area. The concept here would be that members of a specific clan or a certain religious society would do their ceremonies in the kiva. But when it came to activities and bigger ceremonies that affected the entire population, that those activities would take place in a community room. And if it doesn't show clearly, as an example of the size of this, the old photograph is the community room at Montezuma Well. When you walk on the trail, you pass the first room on the edge, a pile of rocks. And if you follow it around to the other end where there's the overlook, another pueblo is there. And just down the trail from that is the community room. And I'll point out the human that's sitting on the wall if you can't see him. Right up here. Okay. To give you an idea of how massive and how tall those structures were when they were constructed. And then there's some unusual kinds of communal structures that have been called racetracks. These consist of long areas, several hundreds of meters long, where all the rocks have been cleared away and put off to the side. And the early settlers in the area called them racetracks. And an ASU graduate student working on his PhD has been studying racing in the Pueblo and Southwest and suspects that that may be a very good interpretation of what these may have been used for. Then we have a one-of-a-kind item which has been called a dance plaza up at the Clear Creek ruin. And that consists of this long sub-triangular shaped structure that has a raised berm around it of maybe 3 meters or so in width and maybe a half a meter or so high. It's really unusual. One of our current ideas on it is that this may be a late version of communal structures originating out of the earlier ball courts. Earlier sites in the Verde Valley have ball courts. We argue about how late ball courts exist. Some people would say that the ball court, for example, at Sacred Mountain is an earlier feature. Other people say, no, it's contemporaneous with the Pueblo, but we really don't have any good data to base either of those suggestions upon. But anyway, we do know that ball courts are gathering places for the population, and this dance plaza may be a late Tuzigoot phase version of that kind of a concept. Probably the most interesting discovery was that when you plot the distribution of the big pueblos, they are very regularly spaced. You can almost, if you just take your compass and just set it for 1.8 miles, you can go on any of the streams or the river and plot where the sites are. And that works almost perfectly for the whole area. And this is so regularized, and it's that same distance factor, regardless of the quantity, the amount of farmable land that we see, that there has to be some kind of a social reason why that spacing is so regular. Again, don't know what that might be, but it is not just chance. This is a formal thing that people are doing. It implies a much broader kind of organizational structure for the Sinagua than most people have given them credit for. Some of the reasons that have been suggested is that the amount of farmable land that is needed for a population of each pueblo is quite limited, and therefore it may be a reflection of how much food that can be produced that would regulate the size of the pueblo. But as I said, the amount of farmable land that you'll find around these sites is quite variable, and that doesn't explain the spacing factor. Another thing that these accomplish is that the spacing takes you from the valleys all the way up to the edge of the Mogollon Rim. And it may be that this sort of corridor is a way that people could obtain and transmit the resources of both the lowland farming areas and the wild plant and animal resources that are found up on the rim. So that if we look at a bigger picture of how does a Tuzigoot phase Pueblo exist, they are not independent entities. They are tied into broader organizations, broader relationships than a single Pueblo. And that would fit, again, with the 1.8, the regularized spacing, as well as being able to have access to different food types, cutting across the different environments that we find in the Verde Valley. Because up on top is where we find, in the Verde uplands, is where a lot of the roasting pits are found. I think that these are almost exclusively Yavapai rather than prehistoric, but my dear esteemed colleague down south, Scott Wood, tells me that they were used by the prehistoric folks. And so we all know you can't argue much with Scott. Then another kind of specialized pattern we see is what I'm calling a chief village. Okay, my Hopi bias will show, and I have no qualms about that. But basically, we've discovered that there's a few sites, a few of our big Pueblo sites, that have a very different settlement layout to them than all the other Pueblos. And they have certain locational characteristics and certain artifactual characteristics that also set them aside. These characteristics are that they're on a high hilltop, they are associated usually with a ball court, they are along areas that we think are likely trade routes, they have more decorated pottery than other sites in the area do. They usually have an encircling wall that divides the Pueblo into two different enclosed plazas, and they usually have a community room. Now, all of those characteristics are found at the sites that we see of Sugarloaf, Sacred Mountain, and to a degree, Clear Creek ruins. And I think that these sites are probably, chief villages, that they are the preeminent ones within a drainage system. It looks to me like each of our drainages consists of one of these social systems. And within each of these drainages, you have one such site, which is probably the preeminent one of that entire chain. We also see that a lot of these Pueblos occur in clusters. Specifically, you have a cluster at Tuzigoot compared to the Tuzigoot Extension and Hatalakva, and another small Pueblo around Poly's Mesa, sort of on the edges of the Verde Valley off to the east, and around Mindeleff's Cavate Lodge group down at the end of the Middle Verde area. These are a good guess on that these are the result of increasing population, that as either increasing population or people coming in to join the population. It's quite common in the Pueblos that when newcomers arrive and wanting to join them, quite often they are told to, live over there until we have a better idea of who you are and what you can offer us and why we should let you come in and live with us side by side. Other people would suggest that these people are of a different group, or another possibility is that as the population increases, again, given the sort of the critical mass of any individual Pueblo and the abilities of the people to basically control and manage the population and the resources, when that gets extended too far, that a group will bud off, not the other word, bud off to form a separate little community in the same general area as the, quote, mother village. And then a real fascinating one is that there's another spacing factor of about 18 to 20 miles. If you look at the biggest sites in the valley, they're spaced about 18 to 20 miles apart. And if you take that roughly 20-mile radius from the Verde Valley, you can begin to find other major big Pueblos in other parts of central Arizona. So it suggests that the spacing factor has some broader population aspects to it that again imply much higher levels of social integration and organization than a lot of people want to give the central Arizona folks credit for. So the Bridgeport ruin and Mindeleff's Cavate Lodge neatly divides the valley into three almost equally sized areas. And again, the first crack interpretation of that would indicate that even though you have local communities consisting of a single pueblo, linked at a higher level into a drainage cluster, that these drainage clusters may also have another organizational level that would divide the Verde into 3 supergroups, just looking at it that way. So you have at least these 3 different levels of organization going on, I think, during the Tuzigoot phase. Now, I also think that part of the explanation on why the Verde has so much stuff going on in this late phase is due to trade and exchange. Because we know that there are major trails that run from different parts of the Southwest through the Verde Valley. There was a major one, for example, from Prescott up Sycamore Canyon, all the way up into Flagstaff by way of Deadman's Wash into the Wupatki Basin. We can identify this one because sites that occur along Deadman's Wash and up in Wupatki have a much higher frequency of your favorite pottery type, Prescott Gray and Prescott Black on Gray, than you'll find when you get, say, a mile or so beyond that particular corridor area. And in fact, up at Nalakihu in the Wupatki National Monument, fully 1/3 of all the pottery at the site was Prescott Grayware. And we know that it's all imported from Prescott, not local copies, because it has the distinctive mica in it that you find in classic Prescott pottery. Then there's the famous Palatkwapi Trail, named by Dr. Jim Burke at a history prof at NAU, that is a prehistoric and historic period trail that connected the Hopi Mesas with the Winslow area and then across to the Verde area, and from the Verde, one trail branched down to the south into the Phoenix Basin, and another went to the north up into the Flagstaff area. So on these major trade routes, we see pottery from different areas coming in as the definitive hallmarks that we can use for dating the different aspects of the Tuzigoot phase. You have, on the early end of things, Kayenta Black on White from the Kayenta Pueblo folks to the north. Later you'll have Jedito from the Hopi Mesas. Just before that comes in full bore, you'll have the Winslow Orangeware, the Tuiuka and Homolobi Polychrome from the Homolobi group of ruins near Winslow. And then also near the beginning, White Mountain Redware in the form of St. John's Black on Red and St. John's Polychrome. So we're seeing influences coming in from the north, the northeast, and the far east. We also see indications of trade from other areas, with shell coming in from the Pacific coast and macaws coming in from central Mexico. Oddly enough, we don't find any copper bells in the Verde yet. I'm sure they're here, and it's just a matter of lack of excavation why we're not finding them. And then we have one of the most enigmatic sherds that we've found in the Verde Valley. And that's this one on the lower right, which is a piece of Ramos Polychrome from northern Chihuahua. Okay. That's what I said when I first saw it too. But there's a problem. Do you know where I saw it? Sitting on the mantelpiece of the caretaker's cottage at Brown Springs Ruin. Sitting with a whole bunch of local Alameda brownware pottery on the same mantelpiece. So what's the logical explanation on what it's doing there? That it was found with the local pottery? Or did somebody pick it up when they went on one of Mexico trips and just leave it there with other pottery? This is why we tell people don't pick the damn pottery up, leave it in place. Because if we had had that in context, that would be a signally important find. But because of that, the context has been removed, it's just another pretty sherd sitting on somebody's mantelpiece. So keep looking. Hope springs eternal. But the most curious thing is, despite the fact that the Salado, the group in the Tano Basin, is coexisting at the same time as southern Sinagua, just over the mountains to the east, what's really interesting is they're not talking to each other. Out of all the work that's been done, out of all the survey work, only 33 sherds of one of the Salado polychromes has ever been found in the Verde Valley. And most of those, as you can see, are half of a broken bowl from Montezuma Castle. Something stinks here. These people are not getting along. Yet they're trading with the same people. because you will also find large numbers of Winslow orangeware and Hopi yellowware in Salado sites. So why don't we have communication between these folks? Good question. Maybe they're in competition with each other for whatever these central areas are producing that is wanted by people to the north and south. Now, along with the Gila polychromes, the Salado polychromes, when you find them, they tend to be more frequently found at the southern end of the valley, which is the same place where you find some of the plaza-oriented types of sites. And so there may be a better connection there, a better connection between the Tonto Basin and the lower Verde, because as you keep moving down the Verde towards Phoenix, the occurrence of the polychromes becomes more and more frequent. So their relations are definitely to the south, but not with us to the west. Okay. So what do we have in the Verde that people want? Okay. Well, we do have a wealth of mineral resources. Materials such as argillite, azurite, malachite, very, very important colors and materials that are still used today by the Pueblo folks as well as Navajo and Apache for ceremonial purposes. Okay. And I think one of the really big items is cotton. Cotton for use in textiles. And people who know prehistoric textiles will tell you that the finest textiles woven in the entire prehistoric Southwest, including Mexico, was produced by the Salado and by the southern Sinagua. And when you folks see some of the examples from the dike site, when that exhibit opens, your mouth's going to drop open. Because remember, these are 600, 700 years old, and look at how marvelous those weaves are, the intricacies of the design. They used more different techniques than any other group in the West. Okay. We know that a little bit later in time, probably near the end of things, the kachina concept begins to develop in the Southwest. And as part of the kachina concept, cotton is required. You have to have cotton for ceremonial purposes, both for the clothing that is used for ceremonial purposes, for funerary contexts, because cotton, with its fluffy fibers, is a metaphor for cumulus clouds. And what do cumulus clouds produce? Moisture. And what is moisture needed for? To grow crops, to eat, grow corn, all of that stuff. So it's all related, and everything has some integrated symbolism to them. Clouds also indicate the spirits of the dead, and they are the kachinas who bring the rains to the Hopi in the form of the cumulus clouds. So we may have some precursor to those concepts developing around the same time. Now, there also may be other indications of social complexity by the distribution of some of these big sites and some of our natural resources down here, specifically argillite and salt. Each of those is very important, was very important for trade in the prehistoric Southwest. And near each one of these, there is a big pueblo. And so it's possible that these individual pueblos may have controlled access or have been signally important places in the prehistoric trade system going on during the 14th century. And then my favorite aspect of the whole thing was traveling through Mexico, you'll see things just like this. And this, to me, looks exactly like what the Verde and Flagstaff would have looked like for prehistoric farming. And a very similar kind of lifestyle between Mexican farming peasants and what we see in early prehistoric agricultural groups. You're going to see scattered small plots of corn, depending upon the soils, and small field houses that tend them. If you take the train down to Mexico City sometime, up in the northern part of Mexico, you'll see place after place of these terraced hillsides with corn and small field houses. And that's what I think a lot of the area would have looked like. And I think that we have such good farmland down here that the production of surplus crops may have been a very important part of what was being traded for. And so we did a study looking at the amount of farmable land, arable land, that we have in the Verde Valley. It turns out there's only a few soil types that are really good for agriculture. Luckily, our soil scientists have done some great mapping studies across the forest that shows the distribution of all these different types of soil. And with that, we can quantify the acreage around each pueblo and within the valley of land that is most suitable for agriculture. By looking at records for the Hopi and with some of the, again, the peasant farmers in northern Mexico, we can determine how many bushels of corn could an acre support and how many bushels a year does a normal family need to eat, and convert that into rough population figures. From looking at the pueblos themselves and measuring the size of the rooms, archaeologists have developed strange and arcane formulas to take those dimensions and turn them into people. And we can come up with some halfway decent estimates of the potential population of the Verde, compare that against the amount that could have been supported by the crops, and we find some interesting figures here. If you look at all the pueblos, we see that it suggests roughly 7,000 to 8,000 people. But you have to remember that some of the rooms are used for storage, some of them are probably for ceremonial purposes, some of them could be earlier rooms that were not occupied. And so just as a rule of thumb, we would reduce that by a third, and that brings us down to a probable population size of about 5,000 to 5,500 people. So that would be my estimate on the population we had during the Tuzigoot phase in the Verde Valley. Okay. And as I said, if we look at the kinds of soil that are suitable for farming, you've got one type in the alluvium and the floodplains, basalt-derived rocky soils up in the north, and then mixed soils around the lower part of the Mogollon Rim. Those are our field areas where we find agricultural borders and a lot of the field houses. Then using as I said, the production and consumption figures for Hopi and the Valley of Oaxaca, we can see that just on the arable land that we have on our maps, that does not include the bottomlands, you had the potential to feed between 30 to 43,000 people. Okay. Now, obviously, we're playing a lot of voodoo magic with numbers here, but the tendency is pretty obvious. There's no question that the valley had the potential to more than produce a surplus for its existing population. And even though we don't have the soils data for the private land, in just as rough computations, you could use the bottomlands of the Verde itself that would still produce enough food to support more than 5,000 people. So any way you look at it, the Verde could have definitely produced a surplus. Okay. And I think the Beaver Creek area is our best example of that. For those of you who have been to Sacred Mountain, all the soil in red is the primo farmland, and I know, as Jim knows from having walked over it, trying to recognize those damn field borders, they're lousy. All over these red areas, you have field borders, field types all over the place. Okay. And it also doesn't talk about the intensively managed farm fields we have, like the one at the junction of Walker Creek and Beaver Creek. But again, organizing and having people farm an area of this size, again, indicates levels of organization that most people haven't accepted yet. So between the wild plant foods, between the agricultural potential, it's clear to me that overpopulation, which has been suggested in the past as a cause for abandonment of many parts of the Southwest, just won't work in the Verde Valley. And if they're producing a surplus of food for trade, where would it be going? You've got the Hohokam down south, and they've got plenty of farmlands down there. I think it could very well have been going to their neighbors to the north, their cousins, the northern Sinagua, up in the Anderson Mesa country. Sites like Chavez Pass, Navacoyotaca, Grapevine Pueblo, the Pollock site, Kinnickinnick. These are all big sites that have large pueblos that were all constructed at a single time and also show in-migrations of people moving into them. The population on Anderson Mesa appears rapidly in these pueblos, and it grows very, very quickly. And many of the places where they exist are simply not really good for agriculture. Soils are thin, they can get divested of nutrients after a couple seasons worth of farming corn. And so I think quite likely that the Verde was trading its surplus food up to Anderson Mesa. They've also done some studies in terms of reaping a profit and food keeping itself from rotting, you can only profitably transport food within 275 kilometers from its source. And that's just about what the distance is between the Verde Valley and the Anderson Mesa sites. So I think it's quite likely that we do have a food exchange, and the pueblos in the north, being located along the Palatkwapi Trail, could well be the sources that are funneling the Jedito yellowware and Winslow orangeware down into the Verde itself. But still the big question is, why was the Verde, quote, abandoned? Some of the things that people have suggested, of course, is overpopulation, which, as I just said, doesn't work. The Verde could more than support the estimated population. Okay. Climate change, well, that's another big one that people talk about. But I meant, folks, even with the great drought, which has been theorized as why a lot of people abandoned many parts of the Southwest, not for one moment do I believe that the Verde River dried up, or that Beaver Creek did, or Spring Creek, or all the other spring-fed streams that come off of the Verde River. So, and we also know that the populations survived through another big drought period in the late 1100s. And so they had experience, they knew about changing weather conditions, and so I just don't think climate change is enough to explain the demise. Warfare, of course, is everybody's long-term favorite. The earliest people, the mountain men who came into the Verde Valley, were the first ones to point out the defensive location of many of the pueblos. And a lot of the early literature talks about warfare back and forth of these warring barbarians and these savages back in our human evolutionary, societal evolutionary kinds of concepts. And things that people point to say, of course it's defensive, are the hilltop locations that we often see that the pueblos were burned, which people have interpreted as warfare. And so, but if you look at them and say, well, yes, they are in defensible positions, but that doesn't necessarily that they mean that they were positioned there for defense. You could defend them, but there's many other reasons why you build on high places. Where are the most expensive houses in Sedona built? High places. Are they defensible? Well, yeah, I guess they would be defensible, wouldn't they? And then burning. Well, that's obviously ransacking the pueblos, so women and children run screaming as they're getting their throats cut and burning the houses down. Except we also know that the Sinagua have a tradition of burning their structures upon abandonment. Those of you who have worked at Eldon Pueblo know that the early pit houses there, dating to about 900 to 1,000, they're all burned upon abandonment. And nobody's talking about warfare at that point. And the Pueblo itself and the other big pueblos in the Flagstaff area also appear to have been burned upon abandonment. And that's a common thing with many cultures. So just because it's burned does not necessarily support warfare. Again, other reasons for living on the hilltop is you get more sunlight, you get out of the cold sinks, it's breezy to keep the mosquitoes and bugs and stuff off. And as I mentioned before, it's societal. Important people live in high places. Ceremonial places are put, places are put in high places. The Parthenon in Greece. Important people. What is the nickname for where the United States Capitol sits? The Hill. Okay, it's cross-cultural. Okay, and if there was warfare, why? We know that there's not a surfeit of food. They can make plenty of food. And if warfare is so ongoing, why do we see so much evidence of trade? So it just, for me, it doesn't fit. I know my esteemed colleague, Dr. Wilcox, would beg to differ, but we have agreed to differ over many things. Okay. However, most recently, Map Gabbard, the archaeologist at Montezuma Well and Castle in Tuzigoot, has written a paper that's very intriguing. He's pulled together some concepts that people have talked about in the past, but have never clearly pulled together and stated them as nicely as Matt has done. In working with the report and some of the stabilization work at Castle A, Matt noticed that some of the walls of the limestone had burned, and that you could still see the burning results of it. And he wondered if they could obtain archaeomagnetic dates from the burned limestone. For those of you who don't know, when you heat an iron-based substance to a certain temperature, the electrons within the iron will align themselves in a magnetic north-south direction. If you find, say, some burned clay, burned plaster, and you take a sample of that and very carefully orient your sample to magnetic north-south today, there are a couple labs in the country that can take that cube, measure the declination of the iron samples and use that against the plotted wanderings of the magnetic pole through time, and that gives you two intersects at which a site might date. Okay? And Matt called the Park Service specialists over. They took some archaeomag samples, and they did get some dates out of it, ranging from mid-1300s up to about 1450, 1425 or so. But as part of that study, Matt came up with an interpretation that, contrary to what has been said about Castle A, that it was burned several years after abandonment, he's reinterpreted the stratigraphy that was used to form that assumption, and he believes that the Pueblo was burned and ransacked while people were still living there. And what he points out is that we know throughout the whole Southwest, the late 13th and early 14th centuries were periods of strife and struggle, upheaval, population movements all over the entire Southwest. And that was accompanied by changes in alliances as people moved to join different groups, giving up their old ways. And he thinks that there was an awful lot of social stress going on and changes in the nature of relationships due to a number of factors that could include decreasing crop fertility. And along with that, it's a perfect example of what we're now seeing happening due to all of the upheavals in the Mideast. When you have massive population movements of people of different cultural backgrounds, many local people are xenophobic. They are afraid of new ideas, new people, of strangers and outsiders coming into their home territory. And that can be expressed in fear, and it can be expressed in ways of getting rid of those people. We don't want you here. Okay? And that could well be a source of the conflict that people have alluded to, in addition to the breakdown of natural climate, of natural environment. And again, we see that same human activity occurring in today's people in response to the movements of people coming out of Syria. Okay. Following up, a lot of people have suggested that the Yavapai or Apache may have moved into the valley about this time, and we all know what terrible warfare people that they were, okay, and that they would drive them away and make people abandon the area. But our normal picture of the marauding, ferocious Apache warriors only comes true when they have the horse. Prior to the horse, they're on foot like everybody else is. And ethnographically, the usual composition of a war party consists of 15 teenage boys. Adrenaline pumped up teenage kids. Now, do you really expect me to believe that 15 teenagers armed with bows and arrows and rocks are going to terrorize populations of 100 to 300 people to such a degree that they will collectively, 5,000 people, leave the valley? I'm sorry, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Diseases, epidemics, I think that's possible. Years ago, Dr. Colton suggested that as people aggregate, getting in closer proximity to one another, disease increases. It's easier to spread diseases when you have people living in close proximity in poor health. Colton uses as an analogy Boston in the late 1800s, where you had several different, not plagues exactly, but diseases sweeping through the cities of the East due to poor water conditions and poor sanitation. And although it's hard to find evidence of disease in the skeletal remains, because many of those diseases don't register in the human bone, nonetheless, there are pot hunter stories that suggest we could have had diseases running rampant in places. For example, in Perry Mesa, pot hunters have described finding bodies stacked like cordwood in abandoned rooms that had been covered over. So that may be one more thing to add to the equation. One that came up recently, but I think doesn't hold any water to it, is arsenic poisoning. People notice that there are higher levels of arsenic in the area around Beaver Creek and Montezuma Well, and a graduate student at NAU suggested that that may have slowly poisoned people. But once again, people have been drinking the stuff there for centuries, and their systems have adapted to it. She did a study of animal bones from that area and found higher levels of arsenic, but again, not enough to have caused massive deaths and die-offs. So that doesn't really work. Okay. And then the fun part of it is, if you talk to the Hopi people, they are perplexed and amused about, why are you dumb Bahanas asking this? What's the big deal? We went because that's what we were supposed to do. Our ancestors didn't mysteriously disappear. We're here. They didn't disappear, they moved. And we are the results of that. And so to them, it's a nonsense. Don't waste your time asking that question. We moved because we were supposed to. What more do you have to know about? Okay. So once again, is it a question of abandonment or dispersion of the population? Maybe they didn't all go away. I mentioned the problem of dating. We only have the planewares, and most of the sites only have planewares. What about the possibility that the system broke down, people could no longer live in the aggregated communities, and so they went back to earlier single-family oriented kinds of existence? And many of these smaller pueblos that we find don't have anything decorated on them, and although we assume that they're Hananki phase, we can't demonstrate that. They could well be Tuzigoot phase, they could be even later. So maybe people hung around a lot longer than we think they did. Same thing with a lot of the cavates in the upper reaches of the highlands. Lack of decorated shirts, same thing. If the society is breaking down, you wouldn't expect them to have many trade wares because everybody is in turmoil and the trade systems have fallen apart. It's also possible that Sinagua and some of the Yavapai merged with some of the Sinagua. They both did hunting and gathering economies. Even though we say Sinagua were primarily farmers, they still hunted and lived off the land. And if you have a dispersion of the organized societies, I don't see any reason why, with the passage of time, that you wouldn't have had some intermarriage between the groups. In fact, we have some indications that, well, we know that people were living here in the Verde at the same time. The Yavapai were definitely here by at least 1250, if not earlier. We know Sinagua are here till late 1300s, early 1400s. And so there had to be mixtures between the group, so relationships would already have been established before things got so bad that people had to make major changes for them. It's also interesting that the earliest explorers, when they encountered groups of Yavapai, each time they found them in close proximity to where one of the big pueblos had been located in earlier times. Dating is still a problem. As I mentioned, the only dates we have from the Tuzigoot phase all range in the early to mid 1300s. The lack of finding later sherds, other than a very few number of Wupatki polychromes and one Heshatoothla polychrome, these are types that are made around 1400. And the fact that they're so rare leads me to start wondering if the Verde may not have been, quote, abandoned earlier than 1400. That most people were probably leaving here during the late 1300s, 1375 or so. So we've learned that, first off, there's no undiscovered Tuzigoot phase pueblos. If anybody finds a 100-room pueblo, I'll give you $100. What we've also noticed is that when we have good survey coverage, it looks like the area that was going to become a center for the Tuzigoot phase already had people living it in previous time periods. This shows you the Clear Creek area at different time periods, and you can see an initial clustering, an expansion during the Hananki phase, and then an aggregation back in Tuzigoot phase times. So there have always been people living in that area. And I think what this sort of thing demonstrates is that these earliest people had a concept of their territory, their land. And I think that basically their descendants stayed in the general area. They may have moved around within it, but nonetheless they stayed within the circumscribed limits of their territories. And then finally, it's those people's descendants who then aggregated to form the Tuzigoot phase Pueblo at the end of the sequence. So the population is not only the people moving in, but a lot of locals you've been related to for generations that are forming some of these main centers. I've been talking about the increasing level of social organization that we're seeing based upon something as simple as the distribution and distance factors between the different communities. Okay? But we still haven't answered the main big question. Why would any farmer ever want to leave the Verde Valley? No matter what you come up with, it just doesn't make sense. So my concluding work is we still got a lot of work to do. So thank you. Questions?
You mentioned early on that we had pit houses and we had pueblos, and of course we know that Sinaguans built pit houses and pueblos, and they had cave dwellings, and you emphasized that it wasn't a big chronological thing. They had pit houses and pueblos contemporaneously.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the main rationale was for their preferences for the type of house, besides the social idea that people living on hillsides might be more status conscious or something? What would be the rationale for the selection of these at the same time, some pit houses and so on?
Well, like you just said, social differences could easily be one aspect of that. Other one is that where do you want to live in the summertime? Out in a wiki up in the outside, or in a nice cool cave? Where are you going to store your foodstuffs? In a cave or in the pueblo? Okay. Rooms are easier to heat. Well, probably rooms built of stone would radiate more heat in the wintertime with a small fire than would a cave, I suspect. So there are some natural reasons that could be done. And others is just the old human factor, is that we all have different kinds of structures that we use, and we all have preferences for the kinds of houses that we like to live in. So it's probably, just like the abandonment, there's a number of reasons on why people do things. It's not just an either-or kind of proposition. Time would be another one. That when you have cavates to start with, the first settlers may have been, hey, look, ready-made structures, let's move in. And then as time progressed, they'd start building the pueblos. Again, our control of time isn't that good. Okay. Todd.
You said in the late period that the big rooms were being divided into smaller rooms. What do you think was going on there?
New ideas coming into the culture. See how we can get out of these things? Okay. No, it's a good question. Usually, room size is interpreted as being a factor of population and of the uses of the room and who are the people living in those rooms. The best example I can give you is that if you look at contemporaneous sites in the Hopi area, Hopi sites have small rooms, but they also have specialized rooms. They have specialized storage rooms, they have specialized ceremonial rooms, and they have specialized corn grinding rooms. All of those functions, from what little we know of, and by using the Flagstaff area as an analogy, all of those functions seem to have taken place in single rooms in Sinagua sites. So it's a different use of space. And so whatever ideas and the organization of people into groups that goes with those kinds of ideas may be being reflected by that change in architecture. One way I could interpret it would be that when you have everything in one room with your one family, that really makes you more, quote, self-sufficient, and your focus is on your immediate family group. When you start having specialized activities, that to me would sort of imply that you are doing things in those rooms that cover a number of people that are most likely outside your own nuclear family group. And that would sort of lead to the natural concept of aggregations of new populations and new concepts of how to organize your community. So that's the fanciest way I can think of explaining that.
Looking at the California situation today, where there hasn't been rain for months and months and months, was this ever really measurable by looking back 1,000 years and deciding what the weather was like then?
Yes. And whoop, get back here. This is a graph that is the latest on climate projections for the Flagstaff area, and by extension, the area down here. What this does...
Peter, use the mic, please.
Can't read the bottom line either.
Well, I can't talk here and point to the graph at the same time. What do you want?
What are the numbers across the bottom?
Yeah, the numbers across the bottom is time. Okay, time. Okay,
From what year to what year?
from 600 to about 1920s, 1930s. This is a graph that the usual tree ring stuff will show you a relative line of precipitation with amounts above that average and amounts below. It's a theoretical line. It's not related to inches of precip. What the latest work has done is that by combining evidence from ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and bristlecone pine, they are able to not only show you the relative amounts of precipitation, but what the temperatures were as well. Was it warm and hot or cool and hot? Was it wet and dry, or wet and warm, or wet and dry? And what this is showing you is that the spike, the red, is increasing drought, less precipitation, and increasing temperature. And if you look at that on the... Oh, that's the wrong graph. Trust me. The rest of the graph that goes into the 1900s, right at about 1910, 1920, you begin to see that red climbing. And it keeps climbing, and it gets to a level that you have not seen at any previous point of time in history. In other words, since about 1920, 1930, increasing drought, increasing dryness has happened at levels that have never been experienced in the prehistoric past. Even given what people have said is that yes, dry and warm things changes over the centuries, over the years. That's true, but it never to the magnitude that we see starting in the 1900s.
What's the latest belief on why they didn't like build on the west side of the Verde Valley?
I don't know. On one hand, that's a different forest, so I can't see it. My suspicion, though, is I think that there's simply a lot more alluvial areas on the east side, but I'm not positive on that. A second one is that there hasn't been, I don't believe that one. We don't know.
Isn't there a lot more private land on that side too?
I don't think so, not really. As I recall, you don't have as much flat bottom land as you do on the east side. The hills, the Black Hills, as I remember the area, as I picture it in my mind, they're a lot closer to the river than they are on the east side. And so my suspicion would, if I looked at that real closely, is that, yeah, there's more flat land, there's more farmland on the east side than the west side. That's true, too. That's another good point, yeah. Environment.
When's the earliest cotton for our Verde Valley?
I don't know. I know we find it in Honaki phase sites, which would be 1100, say. I would expect it to be a little bit earlier, but I think starting around 1100 you would see an increase of it. And that's partly because cotton was also used for food, not only for textiles, for weaving stuff. And I think as growing corn increases in time, you're going to have other crops expanding in use also. But that, I can look that one up if you really want to know.
I do.
Okay, I'll look it up. Okay. All right, thank you.